The first thing I remember is the sound of boots in the snow. Not quick steps, not rushed or hurried, just a slow, steady rhythm outside the lodge door long after we had locked up for the night. The wind had died down, so the crunch of those footsteps carried clear through the timber walls, each one separated by just enough silence to feel deliberate. By the time I reached the lobby desk, there was no movement outside the glass, only the faint outline of a figure standing still in the dark, waiting for someone to let him in. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that felt just a little too quiet. And if these stories help keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 at the time, working the front desk at a mountain lodge in Colorado. Back then, winters were long and brutal, but the job gave me steady hours and a roof over my daughter's head. The lodge sat on the far side of Monarch Pass, a place most travelers only found when the interstate shut down from weather. It was the kind of building you could drive past in daylight and barely notice, but at night in a storm, its yellow lobby lights stood out like a beacon. Most of our guests were hunters, truckers caught by the snow, or families who had missed their check-in time at the ski resorts farther north. That night had been quiet. Len Turner, the overnight maintenance man, was finishing a repair on the furnace downstairs, and I was wrapping up paperwork in the lobby with a mug of stale coffee. Outside, the snow had settled into a steady fall thick enough to erase tire tracks in minutes. The last check-in had been hours earlier, and I had already set the key rack for the night. That was when I heard the footsteps. He appeared at the door without knocking, just stood there, his face barely visible through the frosted glass, a figure wrapped in a heavy coat with the hood pulled low. I hesitated a moment before unlocking the door, every instinct reminding me how late it was, how remote we were. Still, the lodge had its policy. If a traveler showed up in bad weather, you gave them shelter. When I opened the door, the man stepped inside without a word. Snow slid off his coat in clumps, darkening the welcome mat. His gloves were damp, and he carried no bags, no visible luggage at all. Up close, I saw that he was older than I first thought, maybe mid-50s, with pale skin and eyes that didn't seem to rest on anything. He didn't shiver, though his coat was dusted with ice. "Need a room," he said quietly, his voice flat, more like a statement than a request. I told him we had vacancies and reached for the check-in ledger. Most people made small talk, asked about the storm or the road conditions, but he only stood there watching me write. When I asked for ID, he placed 2 folded bills on the counter, exact cash for the night. No driver's license, no name, just the money, and a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. I should have insisted, but it was late, and something about his calmness pressed me into silence. I handed him the key to room 6, one of the smaller units near the back. He took it without a word and walked away, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Len came up from the furnace room a few minutes later, wiping grease from his hands. "Didn't hear a car pull in," he said, glancing at the guest book. I told him the man had paid in cash, no ID. Len raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, just muttered about finishing his shift and disappeared into the utility hall. The lodge settled back into its usual nighttime silence, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face. There had been something too deliberate in the way he had waited outside, as though he knew exactly how long it would take for me to notice him. Around midnight, I did my routine walk down the hall to check doors. The storm had grown heavier, muffling the outside world into a blank quiet. When I passed room 6, the light under the door was off, yet I heard a faint sound inside. Not the creak of floorboards or the shuffle of a bag, but a steady murmur, like someone talking to themselves in a voice too low to make out. I paused, listening, trying to catch the words. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so sharp I could hear my own breathing. I told myself not to linger, that guests had a right to their privacy. Still, when I turned back toward the lobby, I felt the unmistakable weight of someone standing on the other side of that door, listening just as intently as I had been. The night dragged on. Around 2:30, the phones in the lobby crackled faintly with static, though no call came through. It was the kind of sound we sometimes got during heavy storms, but this was different. The static pulsed in intervals, almost like a pattern. Len came up again to ask if I'd touched the intercom. I told him no. He scratched his head, muttered something about crossed lines, and went back down the stairs. I poured another cup of coffee, but my hands were unsteady, and I spilled half of it on the ledger. I couldn't stop replaying the moment the guest had spoken my daughter's name, except, no, he hadn't said it. That was the thing. I thought of Emma, who was 12, then staying with my sister in Pueblo. For a split second, though, when the static popped, I swore I heard the syllables of her name. Faint, distorted, gone as soon as I caught it. By 4 in the morning, the snow was waist-high against the back windows, and the highway had gone silent. Not a single set of headlights passed. I began shutting down the lobby lights, preparing for the early shift, when Len reappeared. His expression was uneasy. He said he'd been making rounds near the service corridor and noticed room 6's door standing ajar, key still in the lock. We walked down together. The hall was dim, and the air carried a faint smell of cold, like snow had seeped through the wood. The door hung open by an inch. Len pushed it wider, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The bed was made. No wet footprints on the carpet, no coat on the rack, no sign that anyone had ever stepped inside. The only thing out of place was the key itself left, carefully on the nightstand balanced on top of the folded welcome pamphlet. I stood there waiting for some sound, the click of pipes, the hum of the heater, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of a room that had been abandoned before it was ever used. We checked the lot outside, expecting to see tracks in the fresh snow. There were none. No tire marks leading in or out, no footprints beyond the ones we had just made ourselves. Len swore under his breath and told me to write it up as a no-show. But I knew what I had seen. The man had stood at the door. He had paid in cash. I had handed him that key. For years I told myself it was a trick of the storm, that maybe exhaustion had clouded my memory. But sometimes in the quiet of winter, I still think of that moment in the hallway. The hush after the whispering stopped the sense of someone standing there in the dark, listening as I passed. And I never could explain why the static on the lobby phone had seemed to call out a name that only belonged to me. I don't usually talk about this. It was one of those nights where everything felt slightly off, like the rhythm of the place had shifted by half a beat, and it left me questioning details I used to take for granted. At the time, I was 41 and working nights as a warehouse manager on the edge of Allentown. The place handled shipments for several distribution chains, mostly groceries, and hardware, which meant trucks rolled in and out all night. My job was to keep schedules straight, make sure paperwork, match the pallets, and deal with whatever went wrong at 2 in the morning when no one else wanted the call. The warehouse itself was a cavern of concrete and steel. The ceilings were so high they disappeared into shadow above the buzzing fluorescent fixtures. Every sound echoed the whine of forklifts, the clatter of pallets, even the faint squeak of someone's boots on the painted floor. On quiet nights, you could hear the hum of the sodium lamps outside, blending with the distant highway noise. That night was late October, cold enough that our breath showed in the loading bay when the big doors were rolled open. I remember because I kept tugging my jacket closed even inside and complaining about how the heat never reached past the office. It was a skeleton crew, just me, one forklift driver I trusted, and a new hire named Wesley, who had started the week before. He was polite enough, maybe too polite. The kind of young guy who said, "Sir," even when you told him not to. By midnight, most of the paperwork was squared away, and I was double-checking manifests in the office when I heard a metallic clang echo down the dock. Not the normal kind of noise, no pallet jack or bay door, but sharper like a chain snapping against steel. I stuck my head out, expecting to see Wesley fumbling with the lift gate on one of the trailers. Instead, he was standing near Dock 12, staring at the closed door like he was waiting for something. I asked if everything was fine, and he jumped a little before nodding. Said he thought he heard someone knocking from inside the trailer, but when he opened it, there was nothing there, just an empty space and a faint smell of cold air. I brushed it off, told him the wind could rattle the doors, and went back to the office, but his unease stuck with me. Around 1:30, the driver finished his route and left, leaving just the two of us. The building grew quieter after that, the kind of silence where every small sound carried distant thuds, the whir of the vending machine, even the faint crackle of the intercom that hadn't worked right in years. I made my usual walk through the aisles, clipboard in hand, when I noticed Dock 12's light was still on. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the chain securing the inside latch was unhooked and I knew I had locked it earlier. I found Wesley a few minutes later sweeping near the break area. He looked pale, said he kept hearing something on the far side of the bay. Not voices exactly, but movement, like someone pacing inside the empty trailer. I offered to check with him, figuring he just needed reassurance. We walked the length of the dock together, our footsteps echoing hollow against the concrete. When we reached Dock 12, the air felt colder enough that we could see our breath. I climbed up and tugged the latch myself. The door rolled open with a groan, revealing a hollow trailer lined with frost. Nothing inside, no footprints, no cargo. Still, Wesley swore. He heard breathing from within when he passed by earlier. The kind of claim you can't prove, but sticks in your mind all the same. I closed it again and snapped the chain tight, double-checking the padlock before leading him back toward the office. The rest of the shift dragged. I tried focusing on inventory sheets, but every half hour or so, I found myself glancing toward the dock, half expecting to see that light flicker. Around 3 in the morning it did, a brief stutter like a bulb on the verge of going out. I told myself it was nothing old wiring drafty doors, but then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on metal loud enough to reverberate through the dock. I ran to the door, convinced some driver had returned without checking in, but the yard was empty. No headlights, no engines idling, just the dark stretch of asphalt under the security lamps. Wesley stood frozen a few feet behind me, wide-eyed. He whispered that the sound had come from inside the locked trailer. I called the non-emergency line, and an officer showed up 20 minutes later. By then, the building felt tense, like we'd both been holding our breath. The cop, Officer Brewster, was practical mid-50s calm, the type who had probably seen every kind of call by then. He listened to our story, gave us a long look, and then asked for the key. We opened the dock door together. The trailer was still empty. This time, though, a thin film of frost clung to the floor, and near the center were faint outlines that looked like shoe prints. Not clear enough to prove anything, not detailed, just impressions in the frost that vanished when the officer's flashlight swept over them. Brewster frowned, said maybe a driver had left the unit open, and condensation formed from the cold. He checked the yard again, but found nothing. Before leaving, he advised me to keep the docks locked tight and maybe install another camera near that bay. His tone was measured, but I could see he didn't quite buy his own explanation. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but neither Wesley nor I went near Dock 12 again. At sunrise, I walked him out to the lot and we parted ways without saying much. He didn't come back the next night. He didn't call, didn't collect his last paycheck. Just disappeared from the roster as though the job had never suited him. I stayed on a few more years before moving into different work, but I never forgot that night. Every so often I'd pass the warehouse while running errands and glance toward the row of bays. Dock 12 always stood out even when all the doors looked the same. The memory of that cold air, the hollow echo of those knocks, and the faint outlines on frost never quite left me. And I still wonder if anyone else ever answered a sound from inside when the trailer was supposed to be empty. The last real place I lived as a student was a squat brick apartment building, tucked between the highway and a strip mall. It wasn't the kind of place anyone bragged about, but it was cheap, and I was 19, which meant price came first. I had taken the ground floor corner unit 1B because it was available mid-semester, and I needed somewhere fast. My window faced the lot, where tenants parked under flickering sodium lamps, and the walls carried every sound. You could tell when someone upstairs dropped a pan or when the pipes shuddered from showers taken too long. It wasn't comforting, but after a while the noises blurred into the background of my life. I noticed the neighbor in 1A within my first week. He was older, maybe late 30s, and quiet in a way that drew attention. He never left through the front entrance when anyone else was around. Sometimes I'd hear his door open around 2 or 3 in the morning, followed by footsteps down the hall. But when I checked the peephole, the corridor was empty. I never learned his name. He didn't check mail in daylight, and packages left at the boxes often vanished within minutes. Once I passed him on the stairs. He carried no groceries, no backpack, just a ring of keys clutched in his fist. His expression didn't change when I said hello, and his eyes didn't linger long enough to register me. For months it was just a curiosity, an odd neighbor you barely see. But then the visitors began. The first time it was late January, past midnight. I woke to the sound of voices outside my window. Low, clipped, like people trying not to be overheard. Peeking through the blinds, I saw 2 men standing at 1A's door. Neither knocked. They just waited until the door opened, slipped inside, and the hallway light cut back to dark. It happened again 2 nights later. Different men, same hour. Their cars idled in the lot with engines running headlights off. always with temporary tags or plates too smeared with road salt to read. They never carried bags inside, and they never stayed long. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then the door opened again, and they vanished back into the night. I told myself it wasn't my business. College towns attracted all sorts of arrangements, and I wasn't eager to get tangled in someone else's mess. But when you live alone, sounds carry differently. By March, the visitors were nearly every night. Sometimes the voices leaked through the thin wall between our units. Not arguments, not laughter, just murmurs, punctuated by long silences. One night I pressed my ear against the drywall. All I caught was a single phrase repeated twice by a voice that didn't belong to my neighbor. "You didn't see me here." Then silence followed by the sharp creak of his door, closing. Sleep grew harder. Each time I heard footsteps in the hall, I wondered who was out there and whether they ever glanced toward my door. I began stacking a chair under the knob at night, even though the building's locks were nothing more than hollow brass. By April, things escalated. I came home from class one afternoon and found a folded slip of paper wedged under my doormat. At first, I thought it was a flyer or pizza coupon, but the paper was blank except for a time written in blue ink. 2:00 a.m. No explanation. No name. That night I stayed awake at my desk, the slip of paper beside me. At exactly 2, the sound came 3 knocks against the shared wall between my unit and 1A. Not my door. Not the hall. The wall. I froze, listening. The knocks didn't come again. I moved out that weekend, crashing at a friend's dorm until I found a sublease elsewhere. Before leaving, I told the building manager about the late-night visitors, about the strange note. He frowned, said I must be mistaken. There had been no one living in Unit 1A since the previous summer. It had been vacant for months, supposedly awaiting renovation. I tried to argue, but he showed me the maintenance log. No active lease, no utilities, no record of anyone assigned to the unit. The locks had never been changed, and the key was still hanging in the office drawer. Later, when I pushed him again, he told me not to worry, that sometimes college kids imagined things when they were under stress. But weeks afterward, I saw a patrol car idling near the lot as I drove past. When I asked a detective friend months later, he admitted they had run several checks on the building. Something about reports of strange traffic late at night, people slipping in and out of supposedly vacant spaces. I don't know who I lived beside for those months or what business was carried out through that door. But I still remember the sound of those 3 knocks precise against the wall at exactly the time written on the paper, and the way the manager's eyes shifted when I insisted that someone had been living in Unit 1A. I grew up on a street where nothing ever seemed to happen. Every driveway had the same kind of basketball hoop, every yard, the same trimmed hedges, and most families waved at each other during the evening dog walks. For most of my childhood, it felt like the kind of place where the most excitement was the occasional power outage or kids riding skateboards past curfew. That all changed one spring when I was 16, and I noticed a van parked at the far end of our block. It first showed up on a Tuesday evening in late April, just as the sun was setting. The van was older, pale blue, with rust near the wheel wells. The kind of vehicle you'd expect to see in a junkyard, not sitting quietly across from the Johnsons' house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people parked on our street when they were visiting, and we lived close enough to the main road that random cars appeared now and then. But this one didn't move for 3 days. From my bedroom window, I had a clear line of sight down the street. I began checking each night out of curiosity, and the van was always there. No one got in or out, no doors opened, just a silent, still shape under the streetlight that sometimes flickered with a weak orange glow. On the third night, I thought I saw movement inside, just a faint shift, like someone leaning forward in the driver's seat. But when I looked harder, the windshield reflected the lamplight, hiding whoever might have been there. By the end of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. Not literally, but in the sense that it always faced the same direction toward our house and the ones beside it. My parents brushed off my worry, saying someone probably left it there while traveling. My dad even suggested it might belong to a contractor who would be back for work soon. But the longer it sat, the more wrong it felt. On Saturday night, I stayed up later than usual playing video games, and around 1 in the morning I glanced out the window. The van's headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette burned in the driver's side. Whoever was inside hadn't moved in hours yet. Now I could see the orange ember brighten and fade every so often. I told myself to go to bed, but I couldn't. I kept checking every 10 minutes, and each time the cigarette was still there. At some point around 2:30, the glow disappeared, and the cab went completely dark. The next morning I woke up to the sound of my mom on the phone. She was whispering, which she only did when she didn't want me to hear. She had noticed the van too, and decided to call the non-emergency line. The officer she spoke with said they'd send someone by, but no one came that day. The van remained. Monday night was when things turned. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I heard a car door shut softly outside. Not the usual slam, but a careful click. I rushed to the window and saw the van's driver's side open. 2 figures stepped out. Both wore dark hooded sweatshirts pulled tight, and they crossed the street quickly, heading not toward the Johnsons' house, but straight up our driveway. I froze watching them move with deliberate steps until they reached our front porch. One stayed near the bottom of the steps, while the other leaned close to the door as if listening. I couldn't breathe, terrified they'd notice my light upstairs. After a minute that felt longer than it could have been, the one at the door turned back toward the driveway. They both walked calmly to the van, climbed in, and the engine started. But instead of driving away, they just rolled forward about 10 feet, then parked again, still facing our house. I ran to my parents' room, stumbling over words as I tried to explain. My dad peered through the blinds, then cursed under his breath and called the police. This time, 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, their headlights flooding the street. The van started to move, but the officers boxed it in before it could escape. From my window, I saw the driver being pulled out. A man maybe in his 30s with a scruffy beard and a cap pulled low. The passenger didn't resist, just sat stiffly as if expecting the cuffs. The whole thing was quiet. No shouting, just the thud of doors and muffled radio chatter. Later, Sergeant Williams knocked on our door and spoke with my dad. I stood nearby listening as he explained that the men claimed they were waiting for a friend, but neither could provide a name or address. In the back of the van, the officers found a crowbar, duct tape, and a notebook with several addresses written inside. Our house number was the last one on the page, underlined twice. They didn't tell us much more, only that they'd be taking the men in for questioning, and that extra patrols would circle the neighborhood for the next few nights. My dad thanked him, but his voice was strained. When we closed the door, the house felt smaller somehow, like the walls weren't as solid as I once thought. The van disappeared and life on the street tried to return to normal. Kids rode their bikes again, neighbors waved, and the Johnsons mowed their lawn like nothing had happened. But I never shook the image of those two men stepping quietly onto our porch, pausing like they were rehearsing a moment that hadn't yet come. And sometimes, even now, when I see an old van parked too long on a quiet street, I still feel that same tightness in my chest. Because I know that night they weren't just passing through. They had chosen us. The last steady job I held was working nights at a gas station off Highway 285, about 10 miles outside Alamosa. I took the shift because it was quiet work, the kind where most hours passed with me mopping floors, brewing stale coffee, and listening to the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I wasn't looking for much more than a paycheck and a few hours where nobody bothered me. Nights out there were predictable, almost too predictable. And I guess that's why I noticed the pattern as quickly as I did. The first time he came in, I didn't think anything of it. A man in a blue hoodie hood pulled up tight, despite the mild spring weather, pulled into pump 3 at exactly 3:17 in the morning. He stepped inside, laid $12 in cash on the counter without a word, and went back out to fill his tank. No cigarettes, no snacks, not even a cup of coffee, just $12 for gas. He left within 5 minutes, the taillights fading into the empty stretch of highway. The next night he came back at the same time. Same hoodie, same $12, same pump. He didn't look at me, didn't speak beyond a muttered thanks as he took his change. By the third night, I knew what time to expect him. I even glanced at the wall clock as the second hand ticked closer to 3:17, and sure enough, his car rolled in. It was an older sedan, something American-made, with one of the headlights dimmer than the other. The routine never wavered. After a week of this, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just the regularity. It was the silence. Most late-night customers were drifters, truckers, or locals staggering home from bars, all of them talkative in one way or another. But this man gave me nothing. I tried once to ask if he was driving through town for work, but he only stared for a moment, then turned and walked out. His eyes were the kind you don't forget, pale, almost gray, the kind that seemed to pass through you like you weren't really there. On the 10th night, I decided to test him. When I saw his car pull in, I stepped outside with a broom and pretended to sweep the lot. As he approached, I said good evening loud enough that he had to hear me. He paused, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pocket, and for a long moment he just stood there. Then he gave a single nod, walked past me, and slid the exact $12 across the counter inside. The silence after he left was heavier than usual, like the night itself had been holding its breath. By the second week, I started writing it down in the shift log. 3:17 man in blue hoodie, pump 3, paid $12. I didn't know why I bothered, but it felt important to keep track. My manager saw it one morning and asked why I was logging random customers, so I stopped writing it down, but I didn't stop noticing. Then one night he didn't come. The clock hit 3:17 and the lot stayed empty. I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that my mind had turned routine into ritual. But at 3:23, the car rolled in late, headlights cutting across the pumps. He walked inside hood tighter than usual, and without looking at me, said quietly, "You weren't supposed to notice." He slid $12 onto the counter and walked back out before I could respond. That was the first time I felt real fear. Not the vague unease of watching something strange, but the sharp kind that makes your skin prickle and your throat go dry. I didn't call anyone, though. Who would I even tell? The next few nights, the routine returned as if nothing had changed. He came at 3:17, paid $12, filled his tank, and left. But I couldn't unhear his words. I started checking the security cameras after each visit, rewinding the footage just to watch him walk in and out. Only the strange thing was the tapes never showed his car pulling up. One frame the lot was empty, the next it was just there. Headlights already off. I finally called it in to dispatch on a quiet night. The trooper who stopped by was polite but unimpressed. He asked if maybe I was overworked, maybe half asleep during my shifts. I told him the exact time, the exact amount, and he promised to swing through around 3 just to keep me company. That night, the trooper parked in the corner of the lot, headlights off, sipping coffee from a paper cup. When the time came, 3:17 on the dot, nothing happened. The lot stayed empty. By 3:30, the cruiser pulled out, the officer giving me a small wave as he left. And then at 3:31, the sedan appeared. No engine sound, no approach, just there under the buzzing lights. The man walked in, slid $12 across the counter, and left without a glance. I looked right at the camera above the register, knowing I'd see the same thing later, an empty frame. Then suddenly him already halfway inside. I stopped calling after that. It was easier to just accept it, to let him come and go without interference. But then came the final night. At 3:17, the clock's second hand clicking into place, he didn't walk in right away. I saw him standing outside, pump 3, hood low, hands in his pockets, staring straight at the glass doors. We locked eyes for longer than I could bear. Finally, he opened the door, but instead of cash, he placed something else on the counter. It was a receipt, my receipt from my own logbook, with my handwriting on it. The date on it was for the following night. I looked up to ask him what it meant, but the store was empty. The door hadn't even chimed. Outside, the lot was bare. No car, no man. In the hoodie, nothing but the humming of the lights. The next night, I quit before my shift began. I didn't wait to see if the pattern continued, but sometimes when I wake at odd hours and glance at the clock glowing on my nightstand, I see the numbers 3:17, and I wonder if somewhere out on that highway, he's still pulling into pump 3, sliding $12 across the counter, waiting for someone else to notice. Back in 2015, I was driving west for work, covering a string of warehouses that my company managed between Phoenix and Sacramento. I'd gotten used to cheap motels along the way, the kind with peeling paint and vending machines that ate your dollar without complaint. Sonora was just another stop on the map, a small town tucked into the California foothills, where the road narrowed and the traffic lights seemed to stay red longer than they should. I checked into a place called the Sierra Lodge, a 2-story strip of faded stucco with a flickering neon sign. It was the kind of place where the bed sheets smelled faintly of bleach and the parking lot lights hummed just loud enough to keep you from sleeping too soundly. The clerk behind the desk was a man named Tony Heavyset and tired-looking, who handed me the key card without much conversation. I remember him glancing toward the upstairs rooms as he slid the card across the counter. His eyes lingered longer than seemed natural, like something was pulling his attention that way. When I asked about late checkout, he just muttered that housekeeping came early and changed the subject. I didn't think much of it at the time. My room was on the first floor, just below a corner unit with the number 209. That night, around 1 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps above me. Not the ordinary creaks of someone shifting around, but deliberate pacing back and forth across the floor. The rhythm went on for nearly an hour, and every time I thought it would stop, it started again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, telling myself someone upstairs just couldn't settle down. The next morning, as I checked out, Tony leaned across the counter and asked if I'd heard anything unusual. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. When I mentioned the footsteps, he shook his head slowly and said there shouldn't have been anyone in 209. The room, he explained, hadn't been rented in months. Something about repairs, though the way he avoided my eyes made it clear that wasn't the full story. I left unsettled but didn't press the matter. People get superstitious about things in small towns, and I figured it wasn't my place to pry. Still, something about his reaction stuck with me. And when work sent me back through Sonora, a month later, I made a point of staying at the same motel. This time, I asked for a room upstairs on the opposite end just so I could get a better sense of the place. The lodge was nearly empty, the kind of mid-week lull when only 1 or 2 cars dotted the lot. My room overlooked the stairwell that led up to 209, and that night, just after midnight, I saw a woman climb the stairs and stop outside that door. She wore a pale dress, the kind that looked dated by a few decades, and her hair was long, falling past her shoulders. She didn't have a key, and she didn't knock. She just stood there with her hand resting on the doorknob, like she was waiting for permission to go inside. After several minutes, she turned her head slowly, as though she sensed someone watching. Even from across the lot, I felt the weight of her eyes. When I blinked, she was gone, and the stairwell was empty. The next morning, I asked Tony again about 209. This time, his face tightened, and he said, quietly, that I should stop asking questions I didn't want answered. He mentioned once, almost under his breath, that a woman had died in that room years earlier, though he didn't say how. She never left, was all he added before changing the subject to my bill. I thought about it for the rest of the drive, convincing myself I'd imagined the figure on the stairs, some trick of the light and a tired mind. But later that year, work sent me back through Sonora once more, and against my better judgment, I checked into the Sierra Lodge again. The place hadn't changed, not even the humming lights in the lot. This time, though, when I unlocked my room, I found the key card. Sleeve had the wrong number written on it. Instead of my assigned unit, it said 209. I went back to the desk, holding it up for Tony to see. He paled slightly, took it from me without a word, and swapped it for another. When I asked if it was some kind of mistake, he shook his head and told me not to worry. But I could see his hands trembling as he slid the new card across the counter. That night, I barely slept. What pushed me over the edge was the sound that woke me at exactly 3:11 in the morning. It wasn't footsteps this time, but the distinct sound of a door opening and closing above me. I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening as faint voices drifted through the vents. It sounded like a woman speaking softly, punctuated by long silences. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a man respond, though the words were muffled beyond recognition. The conversation went on for several minutes before fading into quiet. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my bag and carried it to the desk, telling Tony I needed to cut my stay short. He didn't even ask why. He just nodded and slid my receipt across the counter. As I turned to leave, he said something that froze me in place. "If she spoke to you," he said carefully, "don't answer. That's how she stays." I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached Sacramento. For years I told myself it was just a strange coincidence, a tired mind and the weight of local stories building something out of nothing. But even now, every time I stay in a motel and hear footsteps above me, I can't help but think of room 209 and wonder if she's still pacing, waiting for someone to listen long enough to let her in. I was a sophomore in college back in 2016, living off campus in a beige brick apartment building on the edge of Ann Arbor. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the hallway lights buzzed so faintly that the place always seemed like it was holding its breath. I shared the second floor with a handful of students and young couples, but directly below me in Unit 1A, there lived a man I rarely saw. He was quiet, never caused trouble, and only left his blinds half open at night, with the dim blue glow of a television spilling out. The first time I noticed anything unusual was one Tuesday at about 2 in the morning. I'd stayed up coding the way you do when you think you're still young enough to trade sleep for caffeine. That was when I heard the knock, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the neighbor's door. I assumed it was friends of his, but when I peeked through my blinds, I saw a man standing there who looked completely out of place. He wore a business suit and held nothing in his hands, not even a phone, and he didn't fidget the way people usually do when they're waiting. He just stood with his back straight like a salesman who knew the door would open eventually. After several minutes, he left without a word. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same knock, but this time, it was a woman. She had long hair that hung across her face, and instead of standing still, she leaned close to the peephole like she was speaking softly through it. The man in 1A never answered, and she eventually walked away into the dark parking lot without looking back. By the third night, I'd stopped telling myself it was normal. Over the weeks that followed, different people came to that door. Some carried briefcases, some wore jeans. One man wore what looked like a hospital gown beneath a heavy coat. They never arrived together, and they never lingered once they left. Always the same slow knock, always at night, and never a sound from within Unit 1A. I never once saw the door open, and I never heard a television again. Curiosity eventually got the better of me, and one afternoon when I saw the landlord in the hallway, I asked about the tenant downstairs. He frowned as though he wasn't sure which unit I meant. "That one's been empty since last year," he said. I told him I'd seen someone living there, but he just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about unpaid rent and legal paperwork. That night I sat by my window waiting. Sure enough, at 2:07 a.m., another visitor arrived. This one was older, with white hair and a long coat. He didn't knock right away. Instead, he stood back and looked up at my window. I froze, convinced for a moment that he could see me watching, but after a long silence, he turned and tapped gently on the door of 1A. I never heard a response, but something about the stillness that followed made my skin crawl. The man remained at the door for nearly 10 minutes before walking slowly down the hall and out of sight. I barely slept that night, listening to the silence below me, waiting for the sound of a door opening that never came. Eventually, I called the non-emergency police line, telling them about the visitors and the supposed empty apartment. Officer Lyman came by, a stocky detective with a tired voice, and promised he'd check it out. He knocked on 1A in broad daylight, but no one answered, and when he tried the handle, it was locked tight. He assured me he'd follow up, though I never heard from him again. 2 weeks later, the knocks stopped. The hallway felt emptier than ever, like the air itself was avoiding the space outside that door. I thought maybe it was over until one morning I left for class and noticed something strange. Tucked neatly under the doormat of 1A was a folded piece of paper. I bent down and saw my name written across it in careful, even handwriting. I didn't open it. I left it where it was, walked quickly out the front door, and never returned to that apartment after the semester ended. To this day, I don't know what was written on that note, or how anyone would have known my name. I only know that at 2:07 in the morning, when I can't sleep, I sometimes hear that same slow knock in the back of my mind, and I wonder whether the visitors ever stopped coming, or if they only moved on to someone else's door. That was the last memory I felt I could share tonight. Thinking back across these accounts, I realize most of them never reached any kind of resolution. They weren't stories that ended cleanly with explanations or conclusions that could be written down and filed away. They lingered because they resisted answers, because they took ordinary places. Motel stairwells, quiet highways, rented rooms, and bent them just enough to make us uneasy. What unsettles me most isn't what I saw or heard, but the simple thought that all of these stories happened in places meant for rest and passing through. None of us are supposed to remember the gas stations or the motels or the anonymous apartments where we sleep for a season of our lives. And yet sometimes those are the places that stay with us. They hold the quietest echoes of things we can't explain, and they wait patiently until we remember them again in the dark. When I tell myself these memories out loud, I don't hear fear so much as recognition. The ordinary becomes unfamiliar, and the safe spaces we depend on show us just enough strangeness to remind us we're never really in control. That, I think, is what lingers most of all. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories gave you something to think about tonight, I hope they kept you company in the quiet hours. If you'd like to hear more, you can follow the channel, share this with a friend, and subscribe for future nights. Before you go, tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere or lived somewhere that felt wrong, in ways you couldn't quite explain?